She doesn't look like she can afford this seat. Move her to the back." That's what the flight attendant said out loud, in front of everyone. No hesitation, no whisper, just blatant humiliation based on the color of her skin. A black woman, quietly seated in first class beside a white child, was dragged into a storm of judgment she never invited. They assumed she was the nanny. They stripped her of dignity, meal by meal, glance by glance. They even questioned if the child was hers. No one asked who she really was. No one imagined what power she held. And that was their first mistake. What if the person you just disrespected owned everything around you? This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about recognition, about what happens when quiet strength meets loud ignorance. And the moment the plane lands, everything changes. Think you know what's coming? Think again. Where are you watching from? What do you think her secret is? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this hit you, and subscribe, because the truth is about to take off. The early morning sun cast a soft gleam across the tarmac, bouncing off the sleek surface of the Gulfstream G800 like it knew it was kissing royalty. This was a private jet made for empires, its tail emblazoned with a subtle, burnished insignia only insiders would recognize. Naira Ellison didn't need the world to know who she was. Her presence was enough. Every step she took toward the stairway leading into the aircraft was steady, deliberate, grounded in a kind of power that didn't ask for permission. Her black slacks hugged long legs, a slate blouse tucked neatly beneath a wool trench coat, and her only accessories were a pair of gold-plated cufflinks and the small hand of her son, Elio, in hers. The boy was 6, with sandy hair and sea-glass eyes, his laughter sharp against the quiet luxury of the private terminal. The two of them glided toward the jet like they belonged to the sky itself. But not everyone agreed. Whitney Hale, the lead flight attendant, stood at the top of the steps like a gatekeeper guarding the pearly gates. Her posture was crisp, spine straight, blonde bun coiled so tight it could cut diamonds. Her uniform was flawless. Her judgment, even sharper. As Naira approached, Whitney took one calculated step forward, holding up a manicured hand. "Ma'am, the flight crew isn't ready for passengers yet. I'm going to need you to wait inside the lounge." Her voice was sweet, official, but her eyes said something else entirely. Naira didn't flinch. "We were cleared to board," she replied with calm authority. "It's in the flight director's file." Whitney's smile barely moved. Then they must have made a mistake. Standard protocol. Boarding begins with internal crew checks. She glanced pointedly at Elio. "And minors should remain inside for safety." Naira said nothing, only nodded once, elegantly, and turned as if to comply. But as she pivoted, Whitney gave a quick flick of her chin toward the man by the baggage cart. A silent order. He was a lean, gray-suited contractor from terminal security, just finishing a cup of coffee. He caught Whitney's signal and moved with manufactured nonchalance toward Naira. "Ma'am," he said casually, "mind if I take a look inside your bag?" He didn't say it was random. He didn't say it was policy. Because it wasn't. It was profiling wrapped in politeness. Naira didn't move for several seconds. Then, without a word, she extended her caramel leather tote. Inside were only what a mother and executive might carry: a tablet, protein bars, wipes for Elio, his drawing pencils, a silk pouch containing noise-canceling headphones, and a few pages of hand-annotated financial projections. He pawed through them with clumsy fingers, then zipped the bag shut and nodded. "All good." Naira offered no reaction. Whitney, watching from the stairwell, said nothing either. She simply turned and began climbing the stairs as if she had done her duty maintaining order. 10 minutes later, as boarding was officially announced and other guests were ushered onto the aircraft, Naira reappeared at the base of the stairs. She didn't ask again. She didn't explain herself. She simply walked up, one step at a time, with the quiet elegance of someone who'd been judged 1,000 times and no longer gave a breath. Elio tugged her hand. "Mama, why did that man look through your stuff?" he asked, his voice as soft as the wind. Naira leaned down slightly as they walked. "Some people don't recognize what doesn't look like them," she said gently. "But we don't let them decide who we are." Inside the cabin, The scent of bergamot and polished wood filled the space. Leather seats with gold trim shimmered in soft cabin lights. A champagne tray sat ready at the front, glasses untouched. Kylie, a younger attendant with auburn curls and kind eyes, offered Naira a quiet nod as they entered. But from the galley, Whitney emerged again, tablet in hand. "One moment," she said, blocking Naira with the same tension disguised as hospitality. "We've had issues in the past with caretakers boarding instead of the actual guests. I just need to confirm you're listed as a passenger." Naira paused. Her expression didn't change. "And you believe I'm not?" she asked, her voice smooth as velvet over steel. Whitney glanced down at her tablet, searching. The name was there, bold and prominent. Naira Ellison, primary account holder, owner level. But she didn't acknowledge it out loud. "Just routine," she murmured. "Of course," Naira replied, brushing past without waiting for permission. In seat 1A, she helped Elio settle in. Across the aisle, an older couple looked up briefly from their sparkling wine. The woman smiled politely. The man stared a moment too long. Whitney hovered nearby, jaw tight, face struggling to decide whether to smile or retreat. Kylie passed her on the way back from the front. "She's on the manifest," Kylie said under her breath. "Owner tier." Whitney didn't respond. Instead, she said coldly, "Just keep an eye out. I don't like inconsistencies." Her heels clicked in perfect rhythm, a practiced cadence of power, polished by years of serving the elite and quietly deciding who qualified. She approached Naira's seat, her expression tight, professional, but with a thread of restrained suspicion woven into her posture. "Excuse me, Ms. Ellison," she began, voice low but firm. "Just a quick matter before takeoff. We need a copy of the legal guardianship form for the child you're traveling with, Elio, correct?" Naira, who had just pulled a soft blanket over her dozing son, raised an eyebrow, the calm steel in her eyes not fading an inch. "Guardianship?" she echoed, her voice devoid of emotion but laced with razor-edge clarity. Whitney didn't blink. "Yes, ma'am. For travel with minors, especially in high-profile charters, we require confirmation that the accompanying adult has legal custody or written authorization." Naira didn't move, but her gaze sharpened. "My name is on the manifest. As primary account holder, as the person who paid for this jet, as the mother." Whitney tapped her tablet screen and tilted it slightly away, pretending to double-check something that had already been confirmed twice over. "Of course," she said with a tight smile, "but we've had incidents before. It's a formality, really. Just a safety measure." Naira leaned back slowly in her seat, her tone clipped but controlled. "And is this formality applied to every parent on board, or just the ones you didn't expect to see in this seat?" Whitney's jaw flexed subtly, but she pressed on. "We'll need the document before we land. Please have it ready." Without waiting for a response, she pivoted away and made her way toward the front galley, her shoulders rigid, her stride just a bit too brisk. A few rows back, an older woman with a diamond brooch glanced toward Naira, pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. Minutes later, Whitney returned, a single-page form in hand. "Also," she said, tone now dipped in polite threat, "we require you to sign this release. It's a non-disclosure waiver specific to VIP charters. No filming or photography is allowed in the first-class cabin during flight. We take the privacy of our guests very seriously." Naira didn't reach for the form. She simply looked at it, then looked at Whitney. "I've flown this route 7 times this year. Not once was I asked to sign a waiver. I'm also not filming anything." Whitney shrugged, still holding the paper between them. "We've recently updated our policies. You understand, we have some very high-profile passengers on board." Naira's eyes flicked briefly across the cabin. 2 executives in tailored suits, a woman in a Hermes shawl tapping through stock reports on her phone, and an aging athlete whose only high-profile attribute was the volume of his snoring. "Which of them are you protecting for my camera exactly?" she asked coolly. Whitney's smile turned brittle. "Again, ma'am, just procedure." Naira finally took the form, scanning it quickly. It wasn't standard. It wasn't legal either. It was a performative gesture, just enough to send a message, not enough to get them sued. She set it aside. "I'll review it," she said, not committing to anything. Whitney hesitated, as if unsure whether to push further, then turned and left without a word. As the plane reached cruising altitude and cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden hue, Naira sat still, her fingers resting lightly on Elio's curls. Her son was safe. Her identity was intact. But something deeper churned beneath the calm. She had seen these tactics before, subtle, procedural, polite, but always aimed in one direction. She had built empires under this kind of pressure. Now, they were trying to compress her into a caricature again. The caretaker, the nanny, the one who needed permission to exist in a place she had designed. Whitney, meanwhile, stood in the galley with Kylie, whispering low. "Get her signature before landing," she said. "If anything happens, I don't want it falling on us." Kylie looked uneasy. "She's the owner, Whit. This is her plane." Whitney's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't make her untouchable. I've seen women like her crash harder than anyone. They don't stay on top for long." From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Just another luxury flight. Just another day in the sky. But underneath the elegance of clinking glass and soft music was a deliberate orchestration. One that Naira felt with every quiet maneuver designed to remind her she did not belong. The first round of beverages arrived 15 minutes into cruising speed, starting from the front left section of the cabin and making its way backward. Kylie pushed the drink cart with care, stopping at each seat and offering champagne, premium wine, mineral water, served in crystal glasses, chilled to perfection. When the cart reached Naira's row, Kylie paused, hesitated, then reached under the cart and pulled out a single plastic tumbler, filled with lukewarm tap water and sealed with a flimsy lid. "Here you go, ma'am," she said softly, not meeting Naira's gaze. Naira glanced at the cup, then up at Kylie. Around her, every other passenger was sipping their drinks from glass stemware etched with the Skylux emblem. Even Elio, seated beside her with his orange juice, had a smaller version of the same. Naira took the plastic cup gently, holding it for a moment as if inspecting a specimen. "Short on glassware today?" she asked casually, voice low, almost amused. Kylie bit her lip, glanced toward the galley, then nodded quickly and moved on. No apology, no explanation, just quiet confirmation that this flight would not be subtle about where it placed her. 10 minutes later, dinner service began. Whitney personally returned to the aisle. Her presence suddenly magnified now that attention was on food, an element of control she relished. The aroma of seared sea bass and truffle risotto filled the cabin, wafting through the air with decadent intent. One by one, passengers received their meals on polished silver trays, complete with wine pairings and artisan bread warmed to perfection. Whitney stopped at each seat with the same rehearsed smile, making soft conversation, offering suggestions like a maitre d' hotel in midair. When she arrived at Naira's row, her tone shifted just slightly. "Apologies," she said in that syrupy, smooth voice. "We've unfortunately run out of the sea base entree. The catering team miscounted, but we do have a backup option." She produced a small covered plate from the bottom shelf of the cart and placed it gently in front of Naira. When the lid lifted, Naira found herself staring at a container labeled Crew Meal Vegetarian. It was a microwave-warmed tray of wilted rice, steamed broccoli, and something vaguely resembling tofu. Not even garnished, not even plated. Elio, still working on his fruit salad, looked at the tray, then at his mother, his innocent brow furrowed. "Why isn't yours like theirs?" he whispered. Naira gave a small smile. "Because someone made a mistake," she answered softly, placing a napkin on her lap like it was the finest caviar in Paris. "But it's still dinner." Whitney hovered a moment longer, as if waiting for pushback, but Naira simply adjusted her tray and began eating with slow, deliberate motions. The moment passed, or so it seemed. In the galley, Whitney whispered to Kylie, her tone clipped, her pride masked in professional terms. "She didn't say anything," Whitney muttered. "Not even a word. Did you see that?" Kylie gave a non-committal hum. "She's probably used to it," she said under her breath. Whitney shot her a look. "Used to what?" Kylie didn't answer. She returned to inventorying the dessert trays in silence. Across the cabin, one of the older men, A hedge fund executive from Connecticut with too much cologne and not enough tact leaned across the aisle toward Whitney and muttered, "Don't these flights have dress codes anymore?" He nodded toward Naira, clearly referencing her presence. Whitney smirked faintly. Unfortunately, not everyone gets the memo. They shared a quiet laugh before Whitney moved along, her sense of control reaffirmed. Back at her seat, Naira cut through the stiff tofu with a dull knife, unbothered on the surface, but each movement carried weight, each chew measured. She wasn't new to this game. She knew this wasn't about dinner. This wasn't about glass. This was the kind of tactic that didn't speak with slurs or screams. It whispered in omissions. They wouldn't challenge her directly. They wouldn't strip her title or drag her from her seat, but they'd make sure she felt it. Every minute, every bite. Elio leaned against her arm, eyes half-lidded with sleep, and she kissed the top of his head. But for Whitney Hale, the lull was an opportunity, a vacuum to be filled with whispers, not service. She stood just outside the curtain to the galley, phone discreetly angled downward in her hand, eyes fixed on Naira across the aisle. Naira had finished her meager meal with the composure of a seasoned diplomat and was now curled gently around Elio, who had fallen asleep with his head in her lap, his thumb brushing her sleeve with unconscious trust. The moment should have been serene, a portrait of quiet motherhood, but Whitney didn't see peace. She saw a target. She raised her phone, tilted ever so slightly to capture the frame, and snapped a photo. No flash, no sound, just a single frame. A black woman cradling a white child, in a cabin built for generational wealth and manicured bloodlines. With a practiced flick of her thumb, Whitney opened the staff-only Skylux crew group chat and typed, "We need to re-examine policy. Way too many nannies sneaking into premium cabins lately." She attached the photo. Within seconds, reactions popped up, thumbs up, laughing emojis, even one SMH from a co-attendant flying another route. One reply said, "Guess they're letting the help ride first class now." Whitney smirked, pocketing her phone like she'd just won something subtle. Her need for superiority wasn't loud. It lived in suggestion, in gossip, in the illusion of control over people she deemed beneath her. But she wasn't done. Moments later, she approached a passenger in 2A, a woman in her 50s with diamond earrings and a bored gaze, absently flipping through a luxury real estate magazine. Whitney crouched slightly beside her with a kind of confidential tone reserved for hotel concierges and conspirators. "Ms. Aldridge, I just want to make sure everything's going well with your cabin experience." The woman glanced up, mildly surprised. "Yes, fine," she said, "though I did notice something odd." Whitney tilted her head slightly, prompting. The woman nodded subtly toward Naira and Elio. "I'm assuming that's a caregiver." Whitney didn't hesitate. "That's what we believe." She wasn't very cooperative during boarding. No documentation provided. The lie flowed effortlessly. "We're trying to confirm the child's relation to her, just in case." Ms. Aldridge raised her eyebrows, a flicker of curiosity sparked by implied scandal. "Really?" she whispered. Whitney nodded solemnly, leaning closer. "We have protocols for this sort of thing, especially when the minor appears disconnected." The word hung in the air, full of false concern and deliberate ambiguity. "Better safe than sorry, you know." The woman pursed her lips in quiet agreement. "I thought something fell off." Whitney smiled tightly, rising. "If you notice anything else unusual, don't hesitate to call us." She moved down the aisle before the lie could curdle under too much weight. But the seed was planted, and like all toxic seeds, it didn't take long to sprout. Within minutes, Naira noticed it. The shifting eyes, the longer glances, the way passengers turned just slightly in their seats to whisper behind half-raised wine glasses. Someone cleared their throat louder than necessary when Naira leaned to pull a blanket over Elio's shoulder. A man across the aisle tapped his screen repeatedly, but wasn't watching a movie. He was filming. Naira felt all. Not overt, but surgical. The slow tightening of public scrutiny disguised as curiosity. She'd seen this before. At charity galas, on panels, even at board meetings. It was the oldest trick in the book. Dehumanize by speculation, then treat the reaction as paranoia. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. But she did shift slightly in her seat, adjusting her posture not in fear, but in control. If they were going to watch her, she'd give them something worthy of the attention. Elio stirred lightly, his hand curling around the edge of her blazer, anchoring himself to safety. She looked down at him, her face softening for the first time in hours, her fingers brushing back a lock of hair from his forehead. A camera shutter clicked. She didn't have to turn to know someone had taken another photo. Whitney, back in the galley, checked her phone again. New comments flooded the chat. Someone should notify the parents. Is this even allowed? Looks like a lawsuit waiting to happen. Whitney replied simply, already working on it. She wanted Naira to know she was being put in her place. Striding down the aisle with a walk that mimicked professionalism but reeked of intent, Whitney motioned for her fellow attendants, Kylie and a newer male crew member named Darren, to follow her. Their expressions were wary, uncertain, but they obeyed without question. Whitney stopped directly beside Naira's row, where Elio still slept with the fragile exhaustion only children can achieve at 30,000 feet. Whitney folded her arms, looked Naira directly in the eye, and said, just loud enough for the entire section to hear, "Ma'am, we've received a few concerns regarding cabin comfort levels. Some of our guests feel this section isn't quite cohesive." Naira didn't respond immediately. She set down the book she'd been pretending to read, met Whitney's gaze with a stillness that unnerved even the most arrogant, and said simply, "Cohesive?" Whitney didn't blink. "Yes, your current placement may not be the most suitable environment for your situation." She gestured broadly to Elio, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm around him. Children sometimes require extra space, and this section isn't ideal for tending to them. We believe it might be more appropriate to relocate you to our lower forward cabin. Her tone carried no shame, but the words did. Kylie shifted uncomfortably. Darren stared straight ahead, refusing to meet Naira's eyes. Across the aisle, MS. Aldridge pursed her lips as if to say, "I knew it." One man removed his AirPods just to hear better. Another passenger smirked. The show had begun. Naira's voice, when it came, was soft, barely above a whisper, yet it cut cleaner than any blade. "Are you suggesting that this cabin, my cabin on my jet, is too refined for me to sit in?" Whitney tilted her chin slightly. "We're not making any assumptions, ma'am. We just think everyone would be more comfortable." Her smile stretched too wide, too forced. "Especially your little one. We can prepare a space with more legroom, easier access to amenities, maybe a fold-out cot, so he can stretch out." The insult was veiled, but not hidden. It didn't need to be. It was engineered to provoke, to isolate, to reduce. Naira looked down at Elio, then back at Whitney. "He's fine, and I didn't request a change." Whitney's smile twitched, faltered for a second, but she pressed forward. "We're prepared to make the transition smooth. Darren can help with your bag. Kylie can take the boy." Kylie flinched. "Oh, Whitney, maybe." "It's not a request," Whitney cut in, eyes still locked on Naira. "It's a courtesy." For a moment, the world held still. The lights hummed, the air conditioner blew its sterile chill, and the passengers waited for the scene to unfold. The moment the nanny would be escorted out of elite space and placed back into the invisible service role everyone had assumed she belonged to. Naira reached into her bag, not for her phone, not for identification, not for any document to prove her worth. She simply pulled out a silk handkerchief, the edges stitched with tiny gold initials. N.E. She dabbed Elio's forehead gently, adjusted his collar, then folded the handkerchief back into a perfect square. She turned her gaze back to Whitney. "I've endured worse than this," she said, her voice steady, resonant, echoing through the cabin louder than any shout. "But today, I won't reward ignorance with compliance." Whitney's composure cracked for a split second, a tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying frustration. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult," she said, lowering her voice now that it had begun slipping from her control. But the attention had already shifted. A businessman 3 rows up stopped pretending to type. A flight concierge, who had just entered the cabin from the front access hatch, froze mid-step. Even Kylie now looked openly uneasy. Naira remained seated, "Unless you're removing me by force," she said slowly, "I'll remain here in the seat I paid for on the aircraft I commissioned, with the child I gave birth to." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they expanded into every corner of that jet like pressure before a storm. Whitney stared at her, fists clenched at her sides, breathing just a touch too fast. The moment she'd engineered had backfired. She had pushed too far, too fast. What was supposed to humiliate had only hardened Naira's presence. And worse, now people were watching with a different kind of interest. Not amused curiosity, not thinly veiled superiority, but something closer to shame, to doubt, to fear of being on the wrong side of something much bigger than it appeared. Whitney turned without a word and marched back toward the galley, Kylie and Darren trailing behind like shadows unsure of their shape. Behind them, the murmurs returned, softer now, more self-conscious. That type of quiet defiance unsettled Whitney more than shouting ever could. It didn't embarrass her, it exposed her, and she knew it. But Whitney wasn't done. She never walked away from a confrontation until she'd made sure the person on the other end knew exactly where they stood. From the galley, she whispered something low to Darren, her tone colder now, less performative. "We'll handle it differently," she said. "Start with the boy." Darren looked uneasy, but followed instructions without question, approaching Naira's row a few minutes later under the pretense of checking seatbelts. He crouched near Elio, who was now awake and sitting upright beside his mother, playing quietly with a small handheld game console. Darren offered a polite smile. "Hi there, little man. I'm Darren. Could I talk to you for just a minute in the back? Just to make sure everything's good for the flight. It'll only take a second, I promise." Naira looked up sharply, her voice even but firm. "Is there a reason you need to speak with my son alone?" Darren hesitated, glancing toward the galley. "It's just a standard courtesy we sometimes offer to kids traveling with guardians. Helps them feel more included. It's not mandatory." Naira studied his face and then Elio's. Her son looked at her for approval, his brow furrowed. "No," she said clearly. "He's fine here, with me. And he doesn't need to be interviewed mid-flight." Darren nodded awkwardly, stood, and retreated, but the damage had already begun. Passengers near them had heard the exchange, caught the implication again. The suggestion that perhaps Naira's relationship to the child was questionable, worth scrutiny. The cycle of doubt was a virus, passed not through facts, but through whispers. Whitney watched from the galley with her arms folded, her jaw clenched. If she couldn't physically remove Naira, she would find another way to diminish her. She grabbed her crew tablet and opened the internal controls dashboard. Every seat on the jet had personalized settings, lighting, entertainment, even internet access. With a few taps, she navigated to seat 1A, Naira's assigned position, and quietly disabled the Wi-Fi. The system gave no alert, no noise. Just a small flicker that turned the signal icon from green to gray. Whitney justified it to herself quickly. "Probably for the best," she murmured, just loud enough for Kylie to hear. "Last thing we need is a nanny live streaming some racial profiling meltdown on social media. Better to keep things professional." Kylie didn't respond. She stood behind the coffee station, arms crossed, staring out the narrow window. She had begun to notice the pattern, and while she hadn't yet decided what to do about it, she couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. Back in 1A, Naira tapped her phone screen, then frowned when the connection error appeared again. She tried reconnecting, restarting the browser, even checking the settings, but the network wouldn't load. She leaned slightly toward Kylie, who was now returning to the cabin with a tray. "Excuse me," Naira said politely. "I'm having trouble with the Wi-Fi. Could you check if it's down for everyone?" Kylie blinked, hesitated, then offered a rehearsed half-smile. "I'll look into it for you, ma'am." She didn't need to check. She knew exactly what had happened, but she didn't know yet how to stop it. Whitney returned to the aisle, strolling now with a confidence she hadn't displayed since before her humiliation. She lingered near 1A, arms clasped behind her back. "Any luck with your connection?" she asked lightly, feigning interest. Naira responded without looking up. "Seems I've been disconnected." I'm sure it's just a system hiccup. Whitney's smile was tight. Strange. Everyone else seems fine. She let that comment hang, a passive-aggressive exhale. Well, if you need something urgent, just press the call button. Though I assume this is your unplugged time. The condescension didn't land hard. It slid in like a needle beneath the skin. Naira met her gaze briefly, expression neutral. I didn't realize technological errors had such selective preferences. Whitney shrugged. Everything's a little unpredictable at altitude. She walked away again, but this time she felt something shifting. Naira didn't argue. She didn't demand the Wi-Fi be restored. She checked the cabin one last time before descent, pretending to monitor seat belts while glancing repeatedly at Naira, who now sat upright, fully alert, arms crossed, eyes closed, but not asleep. Kylie had stayed silent for the past 40 minutes. Darren avoided eye contact entirely, and a few passengers had subtly shifted in demeanor, no longer amused by Whitney's authority, but increasingly uncomfortable with her persistence. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please remain seated. The descent felt longer than usual. Whitney checked her appearance in the mirror inside the galley, retouched her lipstick, adjusted her collar, and took one last breath as the landing gears touched down. The wheels shrieked softly against the runway, and the jet slowed to a graceful halt on a private tarmac. Whitney turned to Kylie. Let's make sure we're ready to disembark the VIPs first. Standard order. Kylie nodded slowly, voice neutral. Copy. But before Whitney could open the cabin door and begin directing passengers off the plane, a separate ramp locked into place outside. This one wasn't connected to the main terminal. It was discreet, flanked by a black SUV with tinted windows and two personnel in tailored suits stepping onto the tarmac like they weren't boarding, but arriving. Whitney blinked, confused. No one had notified her of incoming security or high-clearance visitors. One of the suited men, early 40s, dark skin, no expression, held a silver attaché case. He didn't stop to speak to the ground crew. He went straight for the cabin door with practiced efficiency. The door cracked open. The man stepped aboard without hesitation, followed by a woman in all-black attire and another man in glasses holding a leather-bound folder. Their energy was not tourist, not guest, not even executive. It was precision, authority, and Whitney immediately felt something slip. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her tone level. The man didn't stop. He walked past her like she wasn't there, scanning the cabin slowly, then looking directly at her. "You're Whitney Hale?" he asked, his voice professional, but with the weight of legal finality. Whitney straightened, confused but holding her stance. "Yes, I'm the lead on this flight." "Who are you?" He didn't answer her question. Instead, he opened the attaché case, produced a sealed folder, and handed it to the man with glasses. The woman beside him stepped forward and gestured calmly toward the cockpit. "Captain may remain seated. This is a client matter." Then, the man turned back to Whitney. "Are you aware who holds legal ownership of this aircraft?" Whitney blinked again. This flight was chartered through Skylux for a primary client. The man interrupted, not impolite, but immovable. "The aircraft designation G700TX-431, including registry and airframe rights, is wholly owned by Ellison Aviation Holdings." Whitney's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry, I what?" The man with glasses opened the leather folder and began laying documents on the fold-out galley counter. Certificate of Aircraft Registration. Federal Aviation Authorization under Private Ownership Code, New York EH. Flight itinerary signed by Ellison Group Management. And ownership confirmation filed under Naira Ellison, founder and principal. Whitney could barely register the words. "That's not possible," she said under her breath. The man didn't blink. "It is. And it's not only possible. It's been true since this aircraft's first commission." Then, as if on cue, Naira stood. Not hurriedly, not with drama, just a single, composed motion, like a queen rising from her throne. Her eyes met Whitney's, calm and steady. Elio clutched her hand, watching the suited people with mild curiosity. The woman in black approached Naira, greeted her softly with, MS. "Ellison, everything is ready," and handed her a custom lacquered pen. Whitney couldn't move. Her chest tightened. She wanted to explain, to backpedal, but her brain couldn't process the reversal, the impossible realignment of power. Naira walked slowly down the aisle, each step measured and controlled, not to perform, but to reclaim. She stopped beside Whitney, looked her full in the face, and said with terrifying serenity, "You spent 6 hours trying to shrink me. You failed." Then she turned toward the group. "Let's proceed." The man with the attaché gave a subtle nod. The other passengers sat in stunned silence, realizing the woman they'd whispered about, speculated over, dismissed, and judged was not only the owner of the plane, but possibly the reason the company flying it even existed. Kylie looked pale but strangely relieved, as if some unspoken guilt had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Darren had retreated fully to the galley and now stared blankly at the steel cabinets, not moving, not speaking. No one said anything. They didn't have to. Less than a minute after Naira exited, the next wave began. A second Skylux jet, identical in design, but marked with a red trim indicating executive-level operations, had landed in the adjacent bay. 3 uniformed attendants stepped off briskly, followed by a tall woman in a pinstripe suit with a Skylux operations badge clipped to her lapel. She didn't acknowledge Whitney or the current crew. She moved through the open tarmac stairway, walked straight into the plane, and made eye contact with Kylie first. "You may return to base," the woman said. Her tone was firm, not hostile, but it left no room for misunderstanding. Kylie looked at Whitney, who stood rigid, then gave a small nod and stepped back into the galley to collect her things. Darren was next. "Operations will debrief you both upon return." No elaboration, no explanation. Whitney swallowed hard, mouth suddenly dry. "What's going on?" she asked, even though she already knew. The woman turned to her. Per Section 7.2 of the Sky Conduct Charter, client-level escalation involving abuse of position or discriminatory profiling triggers immediate personnel reassignment. Whitney's face twitched. "There's been no abuse. I followed policy." The woman cut her off without raising her voice. "MS. Ellison owns this aircraft. She chartered this crew. She has filed a violation." Then, as if coordinated by fate, the cabin's display monitors flickered on. It wasn't the standard Skylux branded landing footage. It wasn't weather reports or safety reminders. It was a video feed, silent, grainy, but unmistakably clear, of Whitney standing over Naira 6 hours earlier, saying, "We've had some issues in the past with Nanny sneaking into premium cabins." Another clip followed, Whitney leaning toward MS. Aldridge and whispering, "We're trying to verify the child status." Then another, her handing Naira the plastic water cup, followed by the dinner tray labeled crew meal. There was no sound, but the visuals told the story in cruel clarity. The final clip froze on a frame of Whitney's expression just after being told the child couldn't be questioned alone. Her disdain was unmistakable. Whitney turned slowly toward the screen, her eyes wide. "Where's that coming from?" she whispered, panic seeping through her tone. The woman in the suit answered coolly, "Live stream. Internal security pulled footage directly from cabin surveillance. It's being reviewed at corporate headquarters and streamed into the shareholder emergency assembly right now." Whitney's knees almost buckled. "Shareholders," she echoed, the word coming out as more breath than voice. "But why?" "Because this isn't about one client," the woman replied. "This is about every client. And every flight where staff believed image mattered more than integrity." At that very moment, halfway across the country, a boardroom filled with Skylux executives sat in silence as the video played. The CEO didn't say a word. The chief diversity officer scribbled notes furiously. And the shareholders, many of them old money, but a growing number part of Naira's business coalition, watched as one of their own most polished employees dismantled their brand credibility in under 8 hours. Back on the plane, the new lead attendant turned to the remaining passengers. "We'll begin your exit shortly. Please remain seated while the crew is rotated. Thank you for your patience." Whitney stood helpless as the replacement crew moved in with clinical efficiency, resetting trays, checking equipment. treating the previous staff like expired stock. Her earpiece crackled with a call from Skylux Command, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she watched the passengers, who'd once looked to her for order, now avoid her gaze entirely. No one said thank you. No one wished her well. They simply sat in silence, knowing the show was over and they had front-row seats to its collapse. Outside the window, Naira Ellison was already stepping into her waiting vehicle, her posture relaxed, her son beside her humming softly. Her inbox, usually filled with flight schedules and praise from clients, now held only 3 messages. One from Human Resources terminating her employment effective immediately, one from Corporate Communications warning her not to speak publicly, and the last from her agency liaison coldly informing her that her contract had been revoked due to misconduct impacting client experience and brand reputation. The day after the incident, Whitney's professional license was flagged by the National Aviation Personnel Board. An internal review from Skylux's parent company submitted a formal recommendation that she be permanently disqualified from elite-tier client assignments. By noon, the term Whitney Hale flight incident trended across multiple industry platforms, not because it had gone viral in the mainstream sense, but because CEOs, airline directors, and corporate travel managers were privately sharing the footage across encrypted networks, making sure their own operations wouldn't repeat the mistake. Her social media presence, once curated with immaculate flight selfies, luxury product endorsements, and lifestyle hashtags like #SkyQueen and #EliteCrew, was abruptly stripped. Every account went dark, not by choice. Skylux's digital division had issued takedown orders through their legal partner, citing breach of code and image violations. Overnight, Whitney's name went from respected to radioactive. Recruiters stopped returning her calls. The boutique staffing agency that once used her as their marketing face quietly removed her from the front page. Within 48 hours, she no longer existed in the circles where she had once thrived. But the real blow came when the email hit her inbox with the subject line, "Notice of Contract Cancellation, Elysium Air Services." She stared at it, mouth dry, heart pounding. Elysium, the private staffing firm that placed her on over 50% of her international flights. The same firm that had negotiated a $2.4 million multi-year contract in her name, was cutting ties. Not investigating, not suspending, terminating. The letter was brief, brutally professional. Due to confirmed incidents violating Section 9 and 12 of our Code of Ethics, your service agreement is hereby voided in full. A final audit of hours and benefits will be processed in 10 business days. Effective immediately, your clearance badges, uniforms, and client credentials are null. No phone call, no explanation, just an erasure. Whitney stared at the screen, then out the window of her one-bedroom condo, where sunlight touched nothing but closed blinds. She had made a career out of appearances, polished smiles, crisp uniforms, curated small talk that reassured rich men they were important and powerful. But now she knew the truth. All that polish meant nothing when your actions cracked through it. The world didn't care how well she poured champagne or folded blankets. They cared about what the camera showed. And the camera showed a woman who humiliated a passenger, that outranked her in every conceivable way, legally, ethically, morally. A woman who used her authority not to serve, but to shrink. That was what stuck. That was what burned her name into the blacklist, now circulating quietly between every major charter, concierge flight service, and client relations department across 3 continents. Her phone rang once, an unknown number. When she answered, a voice spoke briefly, without greeting. "This is Veritas Legal Group. We're following up regarding a pending defamation claim. You'll receive paperwork by certified courier. Do not delete or tamper with any records." The call ended. She stared at the blank screen, pulse thudding. Meanwhile, inside Skylux headquarters, a boardroom wall displayed metrics, client retention forecasts, damage assessments, stakeholder sentiment. A small corner of the screen showed Naira Ellison's company, Ellison Aviation Holdings, had not only renewed its annual lease agreement, but also tripled its aircraft procurement inquiry for the following year. Her influence had not just survived the scandal, it had grown. And Whitney's existence within that ecosystem had been erased so cleanly, so efficiently, it felt surgical. There would be no apology tour, no redemption arc through media spin, no HR seminar to soften the damage. She wasn't a cautionary tale to learn from. She was a closed file. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that echoes inside people who thought they were untouchable and suddenly find themselves standing in the wreckage of their own arrogance. She applied to dozens of positions, lower-tier commercial airlines, airport customer service, even flight scheduling for regional charters. No one called back. Her name had become a quiet warning, a footnote in internal memos that read, "Exercise caution. Flag for client misconduct." Her pride fought the fall at first, but pride doesn't buy groceries, and it certainly doesn't return dignity. The memory of that final moment, Naira's gaze holding hers in calm assertion, not rage, replayed more than the shame. Not because it humiliated her, but because it didn't. Whitney had expected fury, vengeance, a public takedown. What she received instead was grace, and that grace haunted her more than any punishment ever could. One overcast morning, while scrolling job boards she had once looked down on, Whitney stumbled on a listing. Entry-level Aviation Program Coordinator Assistant Ellison Flight Academy. The name hit her like a jolt. The description was modest: administrative support for an urban youth training center designed to educate underserved students in aviation fields. Coffee runs, filing, scheduling. No glamour, no uniforms, just purpose. She stared at the screen for an hour before applying. No résumé métrique, no polished references, just the truth. She hit submit and waited, assuming nothing. But 3 days later, an email arrived. "You've been shortlisted for an in-person group interview. Location, South LA campus." The irony wasn't lost on her. The former gatekeeper of elite luxury now stood outside a converted warehouse, its brick walls painted with a mural of a black girl wearing aviator goggles and reaching toward a paper airplane. Whitney wore no badge, no heels, just plain slacks, a neutral blouse, and a recycled portfolio. Inside, a staffer handed her a visitor pass and directed her to classroom 4. The room was full of life. Young faces laughing, learning, building flight simulators with chipped laptops and scrap wires. Volunteers walked between them, offering guidance. One wall bore a mission statement in bold silver letters: "Flight belongs to everyone." Whitney took a seat near the back, waiting for the interviewers. That's when she saw her, Naira. Not dressed in corporate armor, not flanked by lawyers, but in a navy sweater, jeans, and sneakers. She was laughing with a group of students near the whiteboard, helping one adjust an altimeter reading on a DIY dashboard. Whitney's pulse rose. She almost stood to leave, but Naira looked up, met her eyes, and gave a small nod. Not cold, not sharp, just acknowledgement. Minutes later, a coordinator began introductions and asked each candidate to share their name and reason for applying. When it came to Whitney, she stood slowly, every eye on her. "I'm Whitney," she began, her voice steadier than expected. "I spent a decade in private aviation. I've seen the top of this industry, but I forgot what grounded it. And I'm here because I want to learn again, from the beginning." The room was silent. Then the coordinator nodded, and the next candidate stood. The interview ended, and Whitney prepared to slip out quietly, assuming she wouldn't be chosen. But before she reached the door, she heard Naira's voice behind her. "MS. Hail." Whitney turned slowly. Naira approached, arms crossed, not in judgment, but in thought. "I remember you," she said. Whitney braced herself. "I wouldn't blame you if you turned me away," she admitted. Naira studied her face for a moment, then gestured toward the open classroom behind them. "That girl in the mural," she said, "was inspired by someone who once made me feel small. I wanted her to fly anyway." Whitney didn't understand at first. Then Naira continued, "Everyone crashes. The question is, do you crawl or do you rebuild?" She handed Whitney a lanyard with a temporary badge. "Trial assistant. 1 week. You'll start with the 6 a.m. shift, coffee duty, printouts, inventory." The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. What was the moment that hit you the hardest? Would you have reacted the same way as Naira? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk.